Republicans say Biden ruined the economy, while Democrats say Trump is ruining it now. Each side blames the other. One points to inflation, while the other points to tariffs. One blames government spending, and the other blames protectionism. But what if they are both looking at the wrong problem? What if the real issue isn't who is in the White House, but rather the belief that politicians can successfully steer an economy in the first place? From the perspective of the Austrian school, the question isn't whether Democrats or Republicans are right. It's why both parties keep repeating the same economic mistakes. Today, we are looking at the United States. Two parties, two completely different political messages. Yet time and time again, they produce remarkably similar economic consequences. Most economic analysis starts with numbers like inflation, GDP, unemployment, and interest rates. Analysts compare charts, politicians compare statistics, and voters ask which party managed the economy better. The Austrian school starts somewhere entirely different. It asks a much simpler question. Why do people act the way they do? Because before inflation rises, before a company invests, before a central bank expands the money supply, or before a president signs a tariff, someone first made a decision. And that is where praxeology begins, not with statistics, but with human action. The United States is often presented as a battle between opposites. Democrats promise larger government, social programs, subsidies, and stimulus. Republicans promise lower taxes, less regulation, stronger domestic industries, and economic nationalism. On the surface, they appear fundamentally different, but praxeology asks, what incentives do both parties actually face? Surprisingly, the answer is exactly the same. Both want to win the next election. That single incentive shapes almost every economic decision. Because politicians don't only ask, what creates prosperity 20 years from now? They also ask, what helps me win 4 years from now? And that's exactly where many economic problems begin. Let's begin with the Democrats. Following the pandemic, government spending increased dramatically through stimulus, industrial policy, infrastructure, and subsidies. The stated goal was straightforward: support the economy and avoid a recession. From an Austrian perspective, the intentions aren't the main issue, the incentives are. Governments don't create wealth simply by spending more money. Real wealth comes from production, savings, entrepreneurship, and investment. When governments spend resources, those resources must first come from somewhere: taxes, borrowing, or newly created money. Especially after COVID, the money supply expanded rapidly. Consumers suddenly held more purchasing power. But the amount of goods hadn't increased at the same pace. With more money chasing the same products, the predictable result was higher prices. But Austrian economics argue the consequences go further. Artificially low interest rates and monetary expansion can encourage investments that appear profitable only because money has become unusually cheap. Businesses expand, projects begin, and capital flows into sectors that seems attractive. But if those signals were created by monetary policy rather than genuine consumer demand, many of those investments eventually prove unsustainable. The correction comes later, sometimes years later. Now the political strategy changes. Instead of stimulating demand, Republicans increasingly focus on protecting domestic production. And the tool of choice is tariffs. The argument sounds convincing. If imported products become more expensive, Americans will buy American-made products instead. Factories return, jobs return, and the trade deficit shrinks. It sounds simple. But Praxeology asks the same question again. What happens next? Modern supply chains are global. Many American companies import steel, semiconductors, components, machinery, and raw materials. When tariffs increase those costs, American producers often end up paying more as well. Some pass those costs onto consumers, so prices rise. Others absorb them, so profits fall, investment slows, expansion is postponed, and hiring becomes cautious. Consumers face higher prices, purchasing power drops, and demand weakens. Businesses sell less, inventories accumulate, cash flow tightens. Ironically, a policy designed to strengthen American industry can make many American manufacturers less competitive. And again, the unintended consequences appear only after the policy has already been celebrated politically. By now, a pattern becomes visible. Different parties, different ideologies, different slogans, but structurally they lead to very similar outcomes. Democrats rely on spending, subsidies, and monetary expansion. Republicans rely on tariffs, trade protection, and targeted industrial support. At first glance, these look like opposites, but from a praxeological view, they share the exact same foundation. They are all attempts to improve outcomes through political direction. They replace decentralized market decisions with centralized political decisions. And every time that happens, incentives change. Once political actors can redirect resources. The question is no longer what is most efficient, but what is most politically rewarding. And those two answers are often very different. So why does this pattern repeat? Why do both parties keep intervening in similar ways? The Austrian school gives a simple answer. Incentives don't disappear in politics, they just changed form. In the private markets, entrepreneurs face direct feedback, profit or loss, success or failure. If they misallocate resources, they bear the cost themselves. In politics, the feedback loop is much weaker. The benefits of intervention are visible immediately. New jobs, new subsidies, new factories. But the costs are delayed. Higher prices, misallocated capital, rising debt, slower long-term growth. Often these costs appear well after the next election. So politicians are naturally incentivized to prioritize short-term, visible gains over long-term stability. This is not a moral failure, it is a structural one, and it applies regardless of the party in power. If both fiscal expansion and protectionism distort markets, what is the alternative? The Austrian school does not argue for a perfect policy, it argues for limited interference in the price system. Prices are not arbitrary numbers, they are signals that reflect scarcity, preferences, and millions of decentralized decisions. When government heavily intervene, those signals become distorted. So what would a different approach look like? First, stable money, rather than expanding the supply to manage cycles. Second, open competition rather than protection from foreign producers. Third, neutral rules rather than targeted subsidies. Not because markets are perfect, but because no central planner has access to the dispersed knowledge in millions of individual choices. As Friedrich Hayek argued that knowledge cannot be centralized, it only exists within the price system itself. The goal is not to replace markets, but to let them function with fewer distortions. Critics often respond, "This sounds good in theory, but does it work in reality?" One of the most closely watched experiments today is Argentina. For decades it followed a familiar pattern: high spending, chronic deficits, price controls, currency devaluations, and repeated attempts to solve problems through intervention. The result was predictable: high inflation, weak investment, declining purchasing power. In late 2023, Javier Milei was elected on a radically different platform. He did not promise more intervention. He promised less. Sharp fiscal consolidation, fewer ministries, cuts to subsidies, and deregulation. The short-term effects were severe. Adjustment is rarely painless. Some sectors contracted and uncertainty rose. But key indicators began to shift. Inflation started to decline from extreme levels. The fiscal deficit moved toward balance, and expectations gradually improved. It is far too early to declare success, and Argentina remains fragile. But from a praxeological view, the point is different. For the first time in decades, policy is moving away from continuous intervention and toward letting price signals function again. So, when people say Democrats cause inflation or Republicans cause trade problems, they are usually describing symptoms, not causes. The deeper pattern remains the same. Both parties operate within a system that rewards intervention, not restraint. But Austrian economics asks a different question entirely. Not which policy worked better, but do we actually understand enough to centrally design an economy made of millions of decisions? Mises' answer was simple: we do not. Not because people are irrational, but because the knowledge required is decentralized and constantly changing. That is why the real divide is not between Democrats and Republicans. It is between two views of the economy. One that believes it can be directed, and one that believes it emerges naturally from human action. Everything else is just a variation of that single disagreement.